You mean to say the previous messages aren't recorded? I suppose so. Okay.
Yes.
I'll send them later separately.
Namaste. Good evening, one and all. Welcome to the sixth session of the course, Sense of Past towards Realizing Rāma Rājya. I think we have started realizing and understanding the concept of modernity and the desire towards modernity. Pranava has been able to explain some of the pointers yesterday, and hopefully he will continue the same in today's and the next few sessions also. Pranava, over to you.
Namaskara. Thank you, Sanjeevana. So we are, I thought before we begin today, I'll give a brief summary of what we did yesterday. The effort yesterday was to primarily bring to your attention the various senses in which modernity is to be understood. And as such, the term modernity is a very fluid term. And because it is so fluid, I intended to bring to your attention the latest version that Yuval Noah Harari seems to have pointed out when he said that the act of being modern is to actually strive towards human immortality. So that is a formulation which is, in a sense, very impactful and very meaningful kind of a look at the entire way in which one can place oneself. We also saw the sense in which Immanuel Kant spoke of enlightenment and the sense in which dare to know, the call for enlightenment has been given by Kant. And while these are there on the one side, I deliberately pointed to the idea of modernity as a break from past to be necessarily, say, traced back to that of King Vena, whose reference is something that we find Bhishma tell Yudhishthira, and you also find an echo of it in Srimad Bhagavata, where Vena was necessarily someone who decided to break from whatever existed in the past. So the character of Vena is possibly a very legendary character if one were to understand modernity as a break from past. And it is in the same light that I also discussed about the question of sovereignty, and sovereignty as something which is endemic to what we currently understand as modernity, and sovereignty as a notion which specifically meant supremacy within a territory. And yesterday being Sita Jayanti, I felt it appropriate that reference from Valmiki Ramayana, where one of the very significant passages comes where Sita, not as if she is conveying what is dharma to Rama, but certainly cautioning him as to what could be the consequences of a certain vow that he has taken in say, deciding to eliminate all the Rakshasas in Dandakaranya. So that sequence of the questions that that Sita raises are very, very significant, and they are equally significant in the current understanding of our own world polity and the world order that is created, which necessarily, say, calls for a national sovereignty. And to contrast with this sense of national sovereignty as opposed to that of the past, I specifically refer to the speech given by Sir Muhammad Iqbal on in 1930, which is stated to be that which by many as the kind of foundational idea behind the call for a Pakistan. Or in fact, it wasn't called Pakistan. Sir Muhammad Iqbal called it a Muslim India within India. So the reasons for the same are specifically directed in terms of the Enlightenment modernity which took its birth in Europe, and how this European modernity, which is a manifestation of the Enlightenment in Europe, which is traced to such kind of thinkers like Sir Isaac Newton or Leibniz or Spinoza, Descartes. These are all the points that we briefly looked at. And it is in that sequence of this Enlightenment, which when transposed to that of India, it turned out to be something which is dark regarding our own past. So I tried to point out about, say, what is it that one could actually state about the desire for modernity. Normally speaking, if we take a serious look at the term desire itself, if you've seen the course note, we began by pointing out how the manner in which human action happens has a sequence. Janati, Ichchati, Atha Karoti. So the Ichcha is something that is built on a sense of what is the knowledge that one carries. And that Ichcha, the desire, if one looks at solely about it as a desire, then you can only have two types of desires. One is a desire which is dharmika, and the other which is adharmika. So dharma is either dharmakama or adharmakama. So it is in this framework that if one were to think of modernity and the desire for modernity, the question should be whether the desire is actually such that what we find in modernity is dharma or what we find in modernity is adharma. So one of the key points that one does indeed look for about what we find about being modern, which I didn't discuss greatly yesterday because my focus was on specifying that the desire for modernity was something that transposed to desire for freedom. What kind of a freedom? A freedom which calls for breaking the shackles of whatever are the burdens that come from the past. And this kind of a notion itself, it can have a number of ramifications. And the rejection of tradition is something that is also shown as a point which comes in when the tradition is not found to be something which has the ability to try and address the kind of state and the mindset that one is in the present. I felt that it is in this light that I should bring to your attention a quotation of Professor P.R.K. Rao, one of our professors who was indeed taught us a number of things. In one of his essays, he happens to make a very salient point. He says that stagnant tradition is the eternal refusal to forget the past at all costs, and modernity is the incessant anxiety to forget all of one's past. And therein lies the false binary between quote-unquote stagnant tradition and quote-unquote neurotic modernity. So this question of tradition and modernity has been a kind of point for reference, which has animated a number of debates. But in essence, one cannot possibly say that tradition and modernity can be spoken of as binaries or as something which aren't connected, because the other excerpts that I pasted in this chat box are primarily those that that actually are taken from a very fine work which came only in this century of the Common Era, 21st century. This was from a book called The Theological Origins of Modernity. So yesterday we did spend a significant amount of time to actually trace the importance of Christian thought in terms of how to relate to the Enlightenment modernity, specifically because of its placing in Europe, and how it has meant that there is a separation of the public space and the private space of the kind of life and living that we are actually presented with. Is this that is a point that we are to take in mind. And I also pointed out that modernity has become a matter of fait accompli to a large number of people, unlike the point of what Immanuel Kant suggested about enlightenment, which is about, say, man taking responsibility for all his actions and also finding and defending whatever his decision is in the public space by a rational argument. Now, this kind of enlightenment that Kant has actually called for is something that neither happened in his times nor has it happened even to this day. And in that light, the kind of modernity that Kant has imagined is possibly also a matter of one's, say, dream, because that's a desire which is as yet unfulfilled. So that's a desire for modernity where people take responsibility of all that comes to it. But what actually in turn turns out is that because of the kind of adoption of many things that man is not aware of, for example, the kind of technologies that one uses today, many of the technologies and its consequences in reality aren't conscious knowledge of people. They are necessarily things which are outside the scope of the imagination, and one has to make a great degree of effort in order to understand where we are placed and how to as well try and overcome whatever are the consequences, bad consequences of the kind of usage of these changes which have happened in a matter of time which we weren't clear of. So this is one side of the story. I also did mention about the reference to Raja Rammohan Roy and his desire to try and think of a future which has given a template for the kind of advent of modernity into India, where his desire was to bring about a marriage between the spiritual East and the material West, specifically by looking at the kind of circumstances that he was placed in. And my professor, late Professor Navjyoti Singh, used to repeatedly say that this kind of an imagination of marriage between spiritual East and material West has turned out to be a barren marriage. And we do expect progeny out of marriage, but that's something that we haven't seen. And that is because the very idea to think of India as spiritual is something which is fraught with difficulties. I did make a mention of it in one of our previous sessions, where the kind of way in which we speak of the Indian Shastras in terms of Adhibhuta, Adhidaiva, and Adhyatma, they getting translated in modern times as material, divine, and spiritual, are translations which have certain kind of difficulty. And that also is one aspect. And the other point is that to think of India not to be materially advanced in earlier times is in itself fraught with historical errors. And they are getting corrected, and therefore say this imagination of a spiritual East and material West, however predominant its formulation is in terms of our current thought and the kind of thoughts that animated many of the Indian national leaders, it requires revisiting, and we certainly see some of those instances through this exercise today. So that is one side of the tale. And now the other point is, when one speaks of the desire for modern or being modern or modernity, one of the kind of aspects that one does look forward to is to think of modernity as something to do with something which is new. I'm sure, say, each of us would have fond memories of our childhood when a fresh academic year started, then going to school with fresh books and starting afresh is something that created a necessary kind of very attractive proposition, as opposed to saying, say, continue with your previous year's books and so on. So the human desire for something that is new is something which is a universal fact. And this desire for the new if at all it is actually resulting in a state of affairs where that which is embraced isn't something which is as desirable, then indeed there is a kind of a serious question that one may have to think of. So that desire, which might actually be with a intent that there is something of strength in that which is new. So an embrace of or a desire for modernity comes with a prior knowledge of a certain belief that what is being embraced is actually that which has strength, that which has power. Now, this is a formulation which has been reflected on, and it requires due attention as well. So I thought I'd certainly bring to your attention a specific kind of excerpt. This happens to be from a novel in Telugu by name Veyi Padagalu, which got translated from Telugu to Hindi as Sahasrafand by Sri P.V. Narasimha Rao, former Prime Minister of India. And this original novel was written by Kavi Samrat Vishwanath Satyanarayana. This is a magnum opus, and he makes a very insightful observation. That is, at the end of this this magnum opus novel, so he actually points out to this connection between modernity, which is appropriately translating, say, the question of modernness that is involved in modernity. So he uses the term Nutanatva. So this is a translated excerpt. I am reading it aloud for you. The whole world is moving as though it reckons Nutanatva as Shakti. Shakti is power here. But Nutanatva is Nutanatva. How could Nutanatva become Shakti? And he goes on to say that even a newly born donkey has a tender body. That doesn't mean that, say, that tenderness that one desires is indeed something that actually is present in the donkey as the donkey grows. So the point of desire for modernity and its connect with the desire for being on the side of the strength, on the side of that direction where power actually lies, is also something that I hinted when I referred to Lord Macaulay and his rejection of the education in Sanskrit and Arabic and his preference for English for India. So that's an excerpt which, if you haven't read, I'd certainly want to share, and there's a lot to reflect on that as the point where a great degree of change happened, which erased a lot of our sense of past. So that's something that we'd certainly see in an appropriate stage in future classes. But key point here is that this embrace of modernity or the desire for modernity, yesterday I tried to relate it to desire for freedom. And now I intend to bring to your attention the desire for modernity as a desire for being on the side of power. Where exactly is the sense of power that is actually being imagined or being felt? Now, there is a sense in which an analysis of power and its ontological existence be done based on rigorous philosophy, and each philosophy might have a different accounting of how power can be spoken of. And here I don't restrict myself to political power alone. It can be power of all kinds. And there's a sense in which we refer to God as omnipotent. So that again is a reflective agenda where one can actually think of what does it mean to think of the omnipotency. So the desire to actually favor modernity, which itself is a very interesting characteristic, which say this excerpt from Theological Modernity speaks of, where the author speaks of the uncommon fact that to think of oneself as modern is to define one's being in terms of time. This is remarkable because in previous ages and other places, people have defined themselves in terms of their land or place, their race or ethnic group, their traditions or their gods, but not explicitly in terms of time. Of course, any self-understanding assumes some notion of time, but in all other cases, the temporal moment has remained implicit. Ancient peoples located themselves in terms of a seminal event, the creation of the world, an exodus from bondage, a memorable victory, or the first Olympiad, to take only a few examples. But locating oneself temporally in any of these ways is different than defining oneself in terms of time. So that's something which is a very often found interesting way in which the sense of time is itself brought in terms of our identity and identification. So when modern is actually seen as to be that which is related to the sense of power, to be modern is to be in power or to be associated in alignment with that of the power of the times. This is something which is no longer a new story now. The moment I put it like this, you would find that every time that is there in the past, one could find people who actually sway their way in ways and means by which they act in a manner in which they move towards that which they think is the source of power. An apt example could as well be to think of, because I did refer to Hiranyakashipa as well yesterday, to think of Hiranyakashipa on one side and Prahlada, and to see that while Hiranyakashipa has made the entire world, probably more than the all the three worlds, to chant Hiranyakashipaya Namaha and to find a rebel in his own son, who goes on to say, no, that cannot be the case because that is not true, because there's a power which is higher than that of Hiranyakashipa. So even that alignment of the choices made by Prahlada and Hiranyakashipa are actually related to the question of how one looks at the nature of power and its alignment with the question of one's, being in presence of power and not. So that way speaking, this is not a question that can be necessarily restricted to a moment in time itself. It becomes a story of all times. So given that we have this richness, there is something about, modern times, which actually are the current times that we live in, which are stated to be that of enlightenment modernity, where, a great sense of power is felt to be present in the West. West with a capital W is a kind of formulation which specifically speaks of the kind of influence that its thoughts have had over all our minds in a variety of ways. It is at this stage that I intend to bring to your attention a very significant excerpt. This is a dialogue between Rabindranath Tagore and Rolla. This was in the August of 1930 in Geneva, when Rabindranath Tagore was traveling. And I'd like to present that particular page so that you can as well take a look at it. There are some very significant aspects mentioned. So we find that, Tagore and Rolla, both of them Nobel laureates for literature and very accomplished in themselves. So they are actually discussing about the way in which the future of the world needs to be envisaged and where we are placed and so on. So Rolla is stating that the world is apparently tired of political controversies, and everywhere a want is felt for a better spiritual outlook. Northern Africa, that is to say Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, where conflicting national, racial, and religious politics had created havoc during centuries, we find a large number of people eagerly looking for a message from the East. India, they think, and I may add rightly, is the country that can, at this epoch, give that message to the world. My own books on India and her great representatives have been received with an enthusiasm beyond expectation. Rolla has written a book on Mahatma Gandhi. He has written a book on Ramakrishna Paramahamsa. And his book on Mahatma Gandhi was one of the reasons why there was a great pressure on Great Britain in terms of respecting Mahatma Gandhi, because Rolla called in his book that if one were to see Christ in the current times, then there he is sitting in an ashram on the banks of Sabarmati. So that was something which played a great role in terms of shifting the general public opinion in favor of Mahatma Gandhi. And the other book on Ramakrishna Paramahamsa is also something which is remarkable in terms of the kind of import that it actually carried for the West about India. So my own books on India and her great representatives have been received with an enthusiasm beyond expectation, which proves the fact that every honest effort to represent the spiritual wisdom of India not only touches sympathetic Western minds, but even reaches the hearts of many apparently benighted, politically minded people. I have received a number of letters from men in different professions, telling me how they feel they ought to study India better and seek their consolation in Indian philosophy. Now, of course, there may be a competition of this kind, given the kind of predominance of China, but certainly say this was a time when China hasn't yet asserted itself. But we'll have a very interesting question to address if we had to talk about Rama Rājya in current times, where one necessarily has to also take into account what would the Chinese, how would one actually make Chinese also feel that Rama Rājya is a desirable future for them as well. That's a question that I'm certainly posing for further reflection. Now, let us look at what Rabindranath Tagore has to say on this. It is curious to note how India has furnished probably the first internationally minded man of the 19th century. I mean, Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Ram Mohan Roy had a passion for truth. He came from an orthodox Brahmin family, but he broke all bonds of superstition and formalism. He wanted to understand Buddhism, went to Tibet, studied Hebrew, Greek, Arabic, Persian, English, French, and so on. Traveled widely in Europe, died in Bristol. His study of the Vedas in original Sanskrit led him to the rediscovery of the Upanishads. Some Brahmins of that epoch thought that these Upanishads were forgeries of Ram Mohan Roy himself. Spiritual truth for Raja Ram Mohan Roy did not mean a sort of ecclesiasticism confined within sectarian sanctuaries, nor did he think that it could be inflicted upon people outside the sect by men who have professional right to preach it as a doctrine. He realized that a bond of spiritual unity links up the whole of humanity, and that it is the purpose of religion to reach down to that fundamental unity of human relationship, of human efforts and achievements. His task was a really most difficult one. At his time, there was even less tolerance of religious faith than now, and greater ignorance prevailed about the testimonies of great spiritual leaders in different countries and civilizations. As a rule, men hate to be disturbed out of their self-imposed narrow boundaries, and those who are in power detest being told that their authority is based on injustice. Ram Mohan Roy had a hard time. My grandfather, Devendranath Tagore, was among those whom the Orthodox Hindu society had excommunicated and who were looked upon with suspicion by men of other religions because they were trying to revive the true spiritual traditions of Hinduism and to re-establish them in our country. There are a number of points which are being stated, and what all that you get to listen to out of Tagore is actually his sense of past. And that's an account which has a great significance also because Tagore's voice actually was held with high respect in the country. And Raja Ram Mohan Roy is somebody who has many dimensions that one has to look at, where on one side, his Brahma Samaj tried to do away with rituals. On the other, when the question of rituals for day-to-day requirements of people came in, they necessarily had to find some kind of a template, and they ended up seeking the same template which they essentially rejected. And Ram Mohan Roy was a person who, in fact, one of the things that modern people who point out would be that because he did not want to eat food prepared by somebody who is not from Brahmanas. So he actually carried a Brahmin cook along with him when he went abroad. And for all his senses of this, he intended to as well keep up the point that, say, not losing his caste on account of eating food prepared by somebody else other than Brahmins isn't something that was acceptable to Ram Mohan Roy. That's a question which, say, these days some people do think of. And it's the same story where Rabindranath Tagore, who with 3 of his daughters, all of who were married before they attained the age of puberty, which is the sense in which you find the traditional Indian Hindu marriage system was actually imagined. So that way speaking, even as, say, we consider Raja Ram Mohan Roy and Rabindranath Tagore as modern, in what manner is their understanding of their own being Brahmin is a very interesting point, which must be kept in mind. Now, there's a point that needs to be noticed, that there's also a sense in which, say, the notion of power is actually being established. And Ram Mohan Roy is seeking, as someone, in spite of, say, being in the early stages of colonial power, or, say, building the kind of background where colonial power can as well, say, find its hold over India, Ram Mohan Roy never actually acted in a manner inferior to anybody else. He acted as independently as he would any day. So that kind of an independence of thought in terms of imagining what future could be, and even to try and, say, alter traditions, or rather create a new tradition, which is Brahmo intended to, is a question that poses back to us about the sense of modern. Is it about, say, start of a new tradition, which is a point that we did discuss briefly yesterday. So now the point of this question for the desire for modernity as something that is seeking out a point of addressing something which is found as inadequate in the present is a perennial kind of a quest. So keep this in mind as we shall go through what Rolla has to say further. Rolla says, I've often wondered at the spirit of religious tolerance in India. Unlike anything we have known in the West, the cosmic nature of your religion and the composite character of your civilization makes this possible. India has allowed all kinds of religious faith and practice to flourish side by side. And Tagore says, shaking his head possibly, perhaps that has also been our weakness, and it is due to an indiscriminate spirit of toleration that all sorts of religious creeds and crudities have run riot in India, making it difficult for us to realize the true foundation of our spiritual faith. So as Brahmo, necessarily he had to oppose, say, the kind of extensive animal sacrifice which Bengal was known for. The practice of animal sacrifice, for instance, has nothing to do with our religion. Yet many people sanction it on the ground of traditions, which are not genuine. Similar aberrations of religion can be found in every country. Our concern in India today is to remove them and intensify the larger beliefs which are our true spiritual heritage. So this is the sense in which, say, the sense of the power is being constituted by Tagore's imagination. So Rolla tries to defend, say, the kind of desire for animal sacrifice, but Tagore would have none of it. And we find that, say, Tagore goes on to say, by the way, Tagore's statement that I have never been able to love the God of the Old Testament is significant, because God of the Old Testament said that he is a jealous God. And that's one of the first statements that one finds in the 10 Commandments. So that also is a question that one has to face if one were to as well try and speak of what's the manner in which harmony can be established when a particular God says that I am a jealous God. I love only my people and not those who do not follow me. So that's a question that we must necessarily address, and we'll have to do so in due course of time. Now, Tagore goes on to say, because there's a question that, say, the attitude is not spiritual. So do you think Vivekananda in India tried to check the abuses of this line of animal sacrifice? So Tagore says, so far as I can make out, Vivekananda's idea was that we must accept the facts of life. We must rise higher in our spiritual experience in the domain where neither good nor evil exists, because that binary itself is something that indicates that we are still stuck. It was because Vivekananda tried to go beyond good and evil that he would tolerate many religious habits and customs which have nothing spiritual about them. My attitude towards truth is different. Truth cannot afford to be tolerant where it faces positive evil. It is like sunlight which makes the existence of evil germs impossible. As a matter of fact, today, Indian religious life suffers from the lack of a wholesome spirit of intolerance, which is characteristic of creative religion. This requires repetition. As a matter of fact, today, Indian religious life suffers from the lack of a wholesome spirit of intolerance, which is characteristic of creative religion. Even a vogue of atheism may do good to India today, for I know that my country will never accept atheism as her permanent faith. It will sweep away all obnoxious undergrowths in the forest and the tall trees will remain intact. At the present moment, even a gift of negation from the West will be of value to a large section of the Indian people. Even a vogue of atheism may do good to India today, for I know that my country will never accept atheism as her permanent faith. It will sweep away all obnoxious undergrowths in the forest and the tall trees will remain intact. At the present moment, even a gift of negation from the West will be of value to a large section of the Indian people. And Rolla's insightful response was, I believe scientific nationalism will help solve India's question. So once when we actually look at the question of the scientific nationalism, then and look at the sense of Indian past as it unfolded post-independent India, we do see that the kind of ideas that are shared by Rabindranath Tagore have found their way into practice. And when one has to understand, say, the effort of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru as the first Prime Minister of India, one must necessarily keep in mind that the embrace of modern development and scientific nationalism are things that go hand in hand. So this is something that we are indeed, say, trying to make sense of, and we have a kind of a point from where we need to look at, say, this embrace of scientific nationalism has come about on a specific account of looking at this question of the sense of rationality being missed in the sense of our day-to-day religious life. And that is something that also meant that the creative religion isn't something that was in vogue as per Tagore's estimate of the times, which could as well be, say, true in some parts of the country, not true in other parts of the country. And it depends on the kind of tradition that one belongs to. And this would actually pose the question back onto a more fundamental notion about whether we as people have become jada, or are we as people, as conscious people, chetana. See, this distinction between jadatva and chetanatva in Indian thought is one of the most significant aspects that one gets to notice. And if at all, the sense of desire for being modern and the desire for modernity is actually a claim that says that it is a desire to be a conscious chetana being. And that is something that would necessarily indicate that there is a great dharma in it. So it's a dharma kama there. I'd like to bring to the attention of some of those who joined a little late. I pointed out that when one talks of desire, there are only two kinds of desires possible. It is either dharmika or adharmika. So there's a dharma kama or adharma kama. So when one refers to desire for modernity, then the key question for us to ask is the kind of modernity that we speak of and the desire for modernity. In what sense is it actually being referred to? And if it indeed is actually an indicator for something that is the dharma that one ought to be practicing, then necessarily such a desire is meaningful. And if the desire for modernity and the desire for this exercise of trying to be creative means that it is necessarily enabling us to be conscious of the kind of life and times that we live in. And we are also trying to seek out as to what is the way in which we can deal with the questions which are around. That is something that it indicate that the tradition has not become stagnant, but it is live. And it is something which is active in its formulation. So in that sense, one need not actually have an eternal refusal to forget the past at all costs. In fact, one ought to as well try and forge imaginative ways in which our accounting of, or say our own sense of looking at the past must be able to harmonize things in a manner in which it can as well deal with the kind of experiences in the present. And if at all it is indeed the case that the kind of experiences in the present that we have are to relate to a false understanding of the past, then we do have a great stake in terms of understanding that past, because the point of being modern need not necessarily be something that has to call for break from whatever happened in the past, because that is only possible in conception. But in practice, it's something that always finds a problem, because we are, whether we like it or not, historically situated beings. And that means that we have to carry whatever is the burden of the past that we are placed with. And this is also something, even if I put it in terms of this language, this becomes all the more true for any person who believes in Shastra, who says that we are born with samskaras. And these samskaras are necessarily traces that are from the previous births. And even if one doesn't accept the previous births in such a formulation also, accepting that we are historically situated actually means that we do appreciate what is the kind of role that past plays in terms of what we have to deal with in the present and also in our imagination of the future. So in that sense, the current formulation of or the sense of modernity, which is generally rejected, and which tries to actually avert people from looking at the sense of rejection of, say, modernity, is something that indeed comes to the point where we are to come out of an insistent anxiety to forget all of one's past. Because even if one desires so, it's something which is not going to happen, and it turns out to be neurotic in its approach. Now, if this question is about the jadatva and chetanatva of what we are present in, then one actually has to pose a couple of further questions. We've already seen that the embrace of modern development and scientific nationalism are seen on the side as if they are on the side of the power, which calls for a reflection as to where exactly power lies. And what is power and how do we understand power? That becomes a question which is no longer a temporal question, it becomes an eternal question. And such a question requires to be, say, addressed both in terms of its response, which will be true for all times, and also from that response, how do we as well bring it down to the current times and make sense of it? It is in that light that I'd like to tell you a couple of stories, reference which I did give yesterday, but I'd continue one of such story and also tell another story, which actually is in the context of our current day fascination with robotics and artificial intelligence and many of these say, modern technologies, which are necessarily found to be that where the power is found, and it's something which is being manifested in a great deal. So the first story. So this is a story of Vainya, whose name we did refer to earlier. This is a story of Prithu Maharaja, and this is from from Bhagavata Purana that I intend to bring to your attention. As I've already told you, Vena was someone who did aspire for, say, modernity, that was a rejection of the past, and there was a course correction, and Prithu had to come to power. And because of this, rejection that Vena made, it actually caused a lot of disturbance, and that cause meant that, say, some of the things which were thought to be in place did not find them. For example, say, if at all you find a fertile land and you sow seeds and also you pour water in it, you normally expect that the seed would sprout and it would grow and it will give you fruits. But this thing, which was actually expected to be a natural occurrence, it did not happen post the reign of Vena. And that caused a lot of trouble to Prithu Maharaja. And he was certainly concerned about, say, why is this happening? Because during Vena's times, all yajnas stopped, and all kinds of references to the earlier tradition of trying to ensure that the all beings of all worlds are kept happy, that kind of a sense was no longer present. So then came the question of how is it that this can be dealt with? And I am sharing, say, this particular specific section. I think I have the right chapter. No, this is not the right chapter. Right. So this is one thing which, I mean, modern times, we should certainly be looking at specifically in the context of environmental disasters that are spoken of, like that which happened in Chamoli and so on. So Prithu Maharaja gets angry with Bhudevi. So this is a section from 4th canto, chapter 17 of Srimad Bhagavatam. And I'd read out, say, a specific, a few sections. What you can as well, say, read through in a greater point in time. So Maitreya is responding to the question that is posed. Prithu, hearing the citizens lament that, so what was the lament? O king, suffering a hunger that burns like a fire in the hollow of a tree, we today have come to you to take shelter with you. But you are the appointed person and master to be consulted who must give the orders. Please, your majesty, try therefore to provide us who suffer from hunger with food, O master over rulers of men. If you do not act as the protector of the people and the leader of food supply, we will perish. So Maitreya said, Prithu, hearing the citizens lament their pitiable condition, for a long time contemplated, O best of the Kurus, and discovered the cause. With intelligence, having arrived at that conclusion, he took up his bow and aimed an arrow at the Bhudevi, like he was the angry lord of the 3 cities. Lord Shiva, who once pierced 3 fortresses with one arrow. This is with the reference to, So when the earth saw that he had taken up his bows and arrows, she tremblingly turned into a cow and fled away, as afraid as a deer chased by a hunter. With his eyes turned red out of anger chasing the cow, the son of Vena, Prithu, then laid an arrow on his bow wherever she fled. Seeing the king coming after her with his weapons raised, the goddess ran randomly in all 4 directions, fleeing hither and thither wherever heaven meets earth. Just like man unable to escape from death, she nowhere in the world could escape from the hand of the son of Vena, and finally turned back most scared and very saddened at heart. He said, since you are now the great one of fortune, O knower of the dharma, O shelter of the afflicted souls, please save me. Your majesty, after all, is there for the protection of the living beings. Why do you want to kill someone who is poor and sinless? How can you, whom one considers a knower of the religious principles, wish to kill a woman like me? If no one should ever strike a woman, not even when she is sinful, then what to speak of a personality like you, O king, a human being so merciful and affectionate to the poor? If you break me, this very strong boat carrying all the world, How can you hold yourself and your people afloat then? King Prithu replied, O dear source of wealth, if you do not obey my rules, I will have to kill you because you, while accepting your share of the offerings, do not provide us the produce. Very important point, which I'll explain in a while. You eat the greenest grass daily, but we are never certain of the milk provided by your udder. Is it not demanded to administer punishment to a cow that is thus indubitably in offense? Not very intelligent, disobeying me, you do not yield the seeds for the plants, herbs, and grains for us that originally were formed by the Creator, but now are hidden by you inside of you. To put an end to the misery of all the distressed who suffer from hunger, I will now cut your flesh to pieces with my arrows. Whether it concerns a man, a woman, or an eunuch, kings who will kill those who, with no compassion for other living beings, as the lowest of all, care only for themselves, do not really kill. You, so foolish and conceited, prove yourself to be a cow of illusion. I'll thus, with my arrows, cut you to pieces as small as grains, for I, by the power of my yoga, will personally uphold all these citizens. Being that angry, he had assumed the form of death personified, surrendered planet Earth, who had to tremble all over, then with the folded hands spoke. The earth said, my respects for the transcendence, the original person who with the material energy expanded into a variety of forms. Unto that source of qualities I offer my obeisances, unto that original form of him who with all his love and actions as a doer himself is never affected because he is not bewildered by the waves of the ocean of matter. He who created me as an abode for all living beings, as a combination of the different modes of elements, he standing before me now, in his own right, wishes to kill me with his weapons ready. To what other shelter should I resort but to him? Okay, so now this is a point which here I'd stop and explain, say, the point that is being made that I intend to bring to your attention. We have a legend in terms of pointing out that Raja is even ready to punish Bhudevi for not giving what she ought to give, because she is taking whatever are the offerings given by Maharaja Prithu and his citizens and his people when they perform yajnas. That the entire world is actually formulated on a yajna, and the very idea of a yajna is a formulation which has great give and take, is a key point that one can never miss. And it is in that context that we have someone here who is even saying that for the sake of the people who are doing their duty and not receiving the kind of fruits that they ought to get, I'm even ready to say go to the utmost extent. So then, of course, the story continues. You can as well say read through. In fact, the translation is not so good, so one may not actually get the feel of it, since all of you would have your own knowledge of, say, your own languages. Please do read in your respective languages, if not in Sanskrit, about what is precisely the kind of exchange between Prithu Maharaja and Bhudevi, where she clearly points out certain kind of points about what is it that means to milk her to attain what's the kind of desired things that one would like to get. And she refers to specifically Shastra in that process, and that's a Shastra which in this day we aren't yet clear about, say, how to understand that and try to bring it to practice in the present. So that way speaking, say, the understanding of trying to act as per Shastra in our own lifetime is something that appears to be stagnant in the minds of those who are knowledgeable of it. And even if those who are knowledgeable aren't actually asserting it, then there's a case where it doesn't possibly create a kind of ground for people to try and take it forward. So this is a question that is a practical question where one necessarily finds that the power that is actually vested in Raja, something that is certainly found to be superhuman. And that is the sense in which we find the nature of Indian polity as it is defined. So that recovery of that sense of polity is a question where we do find that the response of Rama to Sita's questions also indicates And on a second note, to think of a point where the current polities, which do not have any say on those things which are generally termed as natural disasters or things which are beyond our control, has never been a kind of an imagination of a polity that is true of the Indian sense of past. So it's a different story that today, when we are in a democracy, we do not even have a sense of a Raja. We have a state, and correspondingly there's a citizen, and the sense of a Raja is something that is missing. And this recovery of the sense of a Raja itself is a great exercise. Forget about thinking about, say, Rama Rājya. So that is a point that we must recognize in the present necessarily, which is precisely the reason why, how at all can one actually recover the sense of a Raja when the sense of the sovereign, because Raja is a sovereign, that sense of sovereignty itself is something that is narrowly defined as it is in the present. It is in this light that the sense of modernity, which has found itself a very fine space by creating a kind of national polity as on today, and the sovereignties that are referred to are necessarily constrained, and the attempt to transcend these by way of some things like Universal Declaration of Human Rights or an entire discourse on human rights, to try and bring in those elements which are not in the current imagination of polity, by bringing in those through other means like that of, say, human rights discourse, when it is not actually being informed of this great sense of richness of thought which is present in these, say, Itihasa Puranas, we would certainly find that, say, there is an inadequacy. And for one to find a liveliness in its tradition, it does require one to as well reflect with these questions in as active manner as possible. And that's one point that we certainly turn to in greater detail in times to come. So now, before I actually say, I tell you the second story specifically with respect to this power associated with the modern technologies and so on, I certainly want to bring to your attention that yesterday I did make one specific point that the reason why I spent good amount of time not talking about comforts, not talking about the kind of advances that science and technologies have caused in terms of the kind of life that we lead, because the desire for, say, modernity is not associated with the kind of comforts alone, though that might be the kind of thing that is apparent to people. The being fashionable, being contemporary, these are all points is how it is apparent. But what is inherently present is a different point which is to be appreciated, and that different point turns out to be the question of the sense wherein our reference is about the politics which are at play, which are underlying these choices about the discernment about what is of comfort and what is not. So not so long ago, there was a time where people would consciously believe that having electricity is something that causes more trouble than otherwise. This is something that you would find present in some kind of communities even to this day. But that's something which, say, isn't considered as true, because electricity is one of the greatest kinds of presents that modern science and technology have given us, given that they have manifested an invisible power and made it manifest. So this manifestation of that which is invisible as visible is necessarily a kind of thing that we see plays a major role. So there are many such invisible things which are to be manifested, and that is the kind of question that Bhudevi deals with Maharaja. And we find that, say, with the help of different types of cows, because it's metaphorically conveyed. So a cow gives milk only when she has a calf. So who forms the calf? is what actually is the question, and we find different kinds of beings come up with different kinds of cows and thereby milk Bhudevi to get what they desire. So that's the kind of legendary tale that we find. So that question of, say, how we as well try to look at the manifestation of the invisible as visible, and whether such a manifestation is possibly something that leads us to life which is dharmic, is a question that is no longer a point which is meant for, say, a specific time. It becomes a question which has certain principles which might be eternal in their nature. So what those are, we'll necessarily have to see. Now, with this as the precursor to that, let me explain to you a couple of upakhyanas which come from a very fascinating text, which is stated to be the conversation between Sri Rama and sage Vasishta. This is Yoga Vasishtam. There are two upakhyanas that one actually comes across. One is called Dama, Vyala and Kata Upakhyana, and the second is called Bhima, Bhasa and Dridha Upakhyana. So this is a story of a asura by name Shambarasura, who was very creative, and he was at loggerheads with Indra and the Devtas. So he was actually very creative, and he prepared machines to fight Devtas. So the first kind of machine that he made, if you find a name for it in Yoga Vasishtam, it's called Tarku Yantra. So late Prasanna Jyoti Singh used to refer to this Tarku Yantra as possibly to be read as what we would understand as today's computers. So that's something which you may not agree, but certainly say, listen to the story. So Shambarasura created machines, and having created these machines, he used to send these machines with a task given, that is to defeat Indra and the Devtas. So initially, many such machines which were created, all of them failed. So they did not actually create any impact. Later, he created three types of machines, Dama, Vyala and Kata. And these three, they were given certain specific instructions. So Dama, Vyala and Kata had specific algorithms that they operated with. So Dama would first identify and catch hold of the enemy, whoever is identified as enemy. Here Devtas, so therefore say Dama had the power to as well identify and capture. Vyala was someone who could, once captured, he would bind them together, bind with, say, appropriate means, and tie them down. So when these two complete their task, then the third Kata comes, and his task was to cut off, behead the enemy. So Dama, Vyala and Kata had very specific roles, and they were actually, say, sent. And Dama, Vyala, Kata were so very, focused in their task that they did not have any other kind of vices, except that they know that they are Dama, Vyala and Kata. So in terms of the Adhyatmic sense, what it means is that Dama, Vyala and Kata know ahankara, that they have a sense of their own ego. Except this, they had everything else, say, cleared, which means that, say, they are no longer, they did not have any sense of Kama, Krodha, Lobha, Moha, Mada and Matsarya, which are said to be the six enemies of man. So here are machines which were created solely with ahankara and no other sense, and given a specific task which defined what they are. So that ahankara actually is loaded with this ability to recognize what they can and they can do, and they were let loose. So with the power of Dama, Vyala and Kata, all the Devtas could not actually find their space, and they could not as well say control these three, and all of them they ran away. So that way Shambarasura could gain a lead, and he occupied Indra's throne, and he became the Lord of the three worlds. So at that time, Indra reached out to his guru, sage Brihaspati, and he asked, what can we do in this state? So Brihaspati said, at this moment in time, these they do not have a manifestation of their ahankara which has grown, and they aren't yet in a state, so therefore we can't actually do anything. But we should as well say find some way out. So how does this happen is, we'll have to do some guerrilla warfare. And every time that Dama, Vyala and Kata succeed, they'll slowly start gaining a sense of their own upper hand. That is, their ahankara increases to this recognition that they are doing something which is unique to them. And once that comes, then you can actually try and attract them with moha. You can send apsaras, you can try and capture them, and then slowly, gradually, you can reduce their strength. But this is a very slow process. It might take 1,000 years. 1,000 divine years is something that we know is not in the range of our current, timeline that we see. So 1,000 divine years is what has to happen before Dama, Vyala, and Kata could be defeated. So this is the Shambarasura's these three instruments which were very successful, and as predicted by sage Brihaspati, the variety of guerrilla warfares, every time that Dama, Vyala, Kata found that they have succeeded, they slowly started getting a sense of their own invincibility, and they felt so very proud. And at that time, Indra struck and started creating a moha in them, and slowly say from their ahankara, they started acquiring all the six kama, krodha, lobha, moha, mada, and matsarya included. So the moment say these entire things actually shrouded them, it took 1,000 years, and then Indra could as well destroy these three completely. By which time Shambarasura realized that something has happened, and then he realized what was the flaw that he has actually created. So what was the flaw? That is the question. So then he started looking at what is the flaw, and then he realized that my desire to actually create such machines which had ahankara is what is the key problem that I found. So I now should make such machines which do not even have ahankara, and they should consider me to be their lord and act as per my desire, and they should have total submission unto me. So now came three further machines. So these machines were called Bhima, Bhasa, and Dridha. So Bhima is someone who has great power, Bhasa, great kind of effulgence, and Dridha, very strong, very firm. Now these were again something that very categorically went and defeated Indra and all the Devtas, and Shambarasura was again back to power. So now the question came about how to defeat these three, because without defeating you can't even go to Shambarasura. And what is the way in which these three act? They act in a manner in which everything that they do, they believe that there is nothing that they are doing. They are basically following whatever Shambarasura desired. They have submitted totally unto Shambarasura, and that is the kind of bhava with which they went about their actions. Given this state of affairs, they did not know what to do. So the only story that we get to know in this formulation would be that all these people, they run and then seek refuge of Lord Vishnu, who always comes up with some kind of way out of difficult situations. And the story goes that Lord Vishnu says, well, what you have identified is very serious, very grave. So we need to as well create a situation where we can move out of it. So I think the only way in which this situation can be overcome is by directly attacking Shambarasura. So I am now, the time has come, I'm going to behead Shambarasura with my Sudarshan Chakra, and he goes and then executes his deed. So Shambarasura is now slain. So now that Shambarasura is slain, Bhima, Bhasa, and Dridha, they no longer have their person in who they have actually vested all their selves. So they went and asked, now who are we to report to? Who is our Lord? Because we only work as per what the Lord has asked. So then Lord Vishnu said, well, you have indeed come up with this question. So my point now would be that since we have come to this state of affairs where you have never acted on anything as per your own accord, so you are in spite of all the kind of actions which killed and caused a lot of trouble to people around, you are not responsible for it. So the only thing that you are to be given is moksha, and he granted moksha to all these three. So at the end, sage Vasishta tells Rama that do not be like Dama Vyalakata, but act like, be in the manner in which Bhima, Bhasa, and Dridha, where you do not think that you are the doer, but you act in a manner in which, say, you are submitting yourself unto greater power than you are. So the reason why I actually thought of bringing this to your attention is that this formulation of where exactly lies the source of power is a point where one may as well want to think of, because the very idea of making a machine is something that gives a ground for people to look at that the creator is the one who has the power. The power of creation is something which is very important, and one of the key aspects that modernity seeks to try and speak of specifically and in an explicit way is to speak of this power of creativity. Now, this power of creativity, it can have very drastic effects if indeed it is actually accompanied by these Shadripus inclusive of Ahankara, but without Ahankara, you can't have creativity at all. So given this state of affairs, it indeed becomes a very fascinating exercise for one to actually start looking at the question of power in modern times and its relation to science and technology. Because modernity and its identification with science and technology, however false it is, it actually lies with something more fundamental, which is about the desire for creation. So this desire for creation indeed brings us to a critical question about what is it that we create and in what manner do we create, and how does this desire for creation be indeed put in a fold which can as well be something that does not violate some of the fundamental truths that one has realized as a part of being in a tradition. And that tradition, which is live, which is active in terms of trying to address the kind of questions that we are placed in. And it is this question that we'll have to explore further when it comes to the point of looking at the Swaraj in ideas, because one of the key aspects, unlike what Tagore had or unlike what Ram Mohan Roy had, we find that, say, a lot of talk about our own presence right now does not seem to be something which has a sound foundation. And it is in that light, even in his times, so Tagore himself, in spite of his insight, he was still a transitionary figure who is trying to create a bridge between, say, the modern and the tradition, however be the understanding of that tradition. But if we as people in current times are more conscious of the kind of parampara that we come from, then naturally a question comes in: how does this parampara in the light of the desire for such modernity, which is indeed directed at being in alignment with that power, which is also recognized by Parampara, is a question that would be appropriate to be posed if we are to think in terms of Swaraj in ideas. And when we are sufficiently strong enough, then it can possibly come to practice as well. So I'd like to stop here, and I'd be glad to take questions or comments and suggestions and so on.
Thank you, Pranavji. And now the floor is open for questions, discussions, or any suggestion, any feedback.
I have a question here. The question is, when India and its tradition is well known for allowing any school of thought with the same reverence and the same respect for every individual and their thoughts from across the world, why is that not a part of Indian tradition as a manner of scientific rationalization? Couldn't that be?
I seem to have lost connection from your first sentence. Could you please repeat it once?
Oh, well, as we know, India has always welcomed the thoughts from all parts of the world. I mean, they have been following what they have to follow, but they have respected all kinds of thoughts from across the world because it's the respect given to the thought system itself. So isn't that, for continuing that way of respecting the thoughts also a tradition of India? The culture of India?
That's a question that we indeed have to address in terms of Swarajan ideas as well. I certainly want to bring to your attention, there was a very recent lecture by Professor Bhikkhu Parekh, who is stated to be one of the leading Gandhian thinkers of modern times. And he spoke on Gandhian Swarajan ideas. I thought I'd just refer to this to address the point that you were making. So he said that Mahatma Gandhi and his understanding of the world and the desire for Swarajan ideas would call for us to think of assimilation, synthesis, or integration of the ideas that are actually presented to us. So, and he also made one point that Mahatma Gandhi, unlike many others, might say that since we are born in a place, we must have loyalty to that place. This is what Professor Parekh actually made a very insightful point on. And I referred to this last week when I said there's this Adhidayavata Dharana that is at work. So the key point is that if one were to indeed say that we are loyal to the kind of place where we are born in, then the question of inviting and embracing an idea that has actually become something which is significant in new times necessarily has an important role to play. So on that count, assimilation, integration, or synthesis is not the only kind of a thing that people might desire to have. There may be senses where some people might say, having understood what it is, we intend to reject it also. So a fascinating question which Professor Navjyoti Singh used to refer to is, he used to say that when this European modernity came about, now imagine you are sitting at home and there is some loud sound or an explosion that happens on the street very close by your home. The moment you hear this explosion or the kind of big kind of hustle bustle which is happening, would you actually try and make an effort to try and learn what it is? If indeed yes, in fact, it used to be the case that in olden times, grandmothers or grandfathers, they used to say to their grandchildren, just go and find out what's going on, say, outside. So one goes there, looks at it, and then comes back and reports. So when something happens, then calling it to, say, understand what is happening is a characteristic of a very active mind. So Professor Navjoti used to say that long before the British actually came to power in India, long before the Europeans indeed say established their own sense of political rule over India, there was a conscious attempt by Indians to try and make an estimate of what exactly this change is about. And this kind of estimate was made, and there were also responses to it which were actually prepared, which today we may not be in conscious knowledge of, and they were fine with rejecting it also. So many of the kind of discussions that we see today, whether it be in terms of one of the leading lights of modern literature like U.R. Ananthamurthy from Bengaluru, who comes from a very traditional family, but who has probably become one of the strongest critiques of tradition. They've always tried to say that maybe there is something in the tradition, but it is not adequate. It is inadequate. So therefore, we must actually try to see what is the way in which synthesis could be worked out, or assimilation can be done, or some integration can be done. But the confidence to actually say that this can be rejected can only come when there is a clarity about whether, say, the kind of strength or the power that we speak of is actually true power or not. The idea which has actually come to us, whether it indeed is of value or not. What is our ability to do a pariksha of the kind of idea that is given to us? Where exactly can a kind of such ability to discernment comes from? If one says that I am part of a parampara, that parampara is what actually offers me where to stand and how to make a judgment. And should it be the case that one has to judge or adjudge? Can we not be without any kind of judgment? Well, it only means that, say, we are postponing it for a later time, because at some moment in time, if we are to actually go ahead and act in the present, we are indeed placed with a question of making a judgment about what's the kind of thing that we accept and what's the kind of thing that we don't. So if there is an idea that has come, how do we as well come to appreciate its value? Whether it is to be accepted or not, whether it is to be assimilated with effort or not, whether it is to be synthesized and brought into the fold or not. What are the kind of grounds on which this happens? This is a question that is at the core of the point. There's a fascinating story also that Professor Navjoti used to narrate, which I think I should mention in the light of the Enlightenment related discussion that we might have. European Enlightenment, I've already stated earlier that may be light for Europe, but it actually caused darkness in other places. And Sir Muhammad Iqbal was one of the leaders, national leaders, who did observe it and made the point very strongly at that time itself. So since he was able to make that claim, not many others were able to recognize what's the point, and that's that kind of a gap is something that we are facing in terms of trying to deal with Pakistan as of today. That aside, the point is, what is the darkness that is caused by the light of Kantian or the European Enlightenment? That's a question that is very valid to be posed, and Professor Navjoti coined a term called endarkenment to describe this. And he used to begin his story of endarkenment by narrating a fascinating short story of Mullah Nasruddin. So Mullah Nasruddin was one fine evening, he was actually looking for something under the street light at a junction in his village. He was looking around and he was trying to see where it is. He was searching for something, and since Mullah Nasruddin was very popular person, everybody in the village, they all wanted to help him. So they came and asked, what's it that you are searching for, Mullah? You see, I seem to have lost my keys, so I am actually looking for it. So then they all helped, and they looked at all the kind of places which can be the places where the key you would have found. And since a lot of people joined, they said, well, they didn't find anywhere. So Then they asked what they should have asked in the beginning itself. Mullah, are you sure that this is the place where the key has fallen? Do you know where exactly you have left it previously? So then Mullah Nasruddin said, you see, just as we go a little further, there's a wall, and towards the other side, I actually happened to lose my keys. And then everybody asked, say, what, Mullah? Don't you even know this, that if your keys are there, then you should actually be searching there, but not here? So then the question came in, Mullah Nasruddin responded, you see, I understand what you say, but there is no light there. I have light here, so therefore I am actually searching for it here. This is something which is insightful in the specific context of India, and not just India, but possibly most of Eastern world, E capital, in contrast with that of West of W capital, where when it comes to a question of what we are actually looking for, that which we indeed intend to look for isn't something that we are actually, say, making the effort to, which might require us to grope in the darkness. And that groping in the darkness is something that is fraught with failures and so on. One may not even have a light at the end of the tunnel. So given that this question of groping in the darkness is what we are placed with, we have a challenge in front of us. And if the response is that because I have light here, I'm actually trying to look for things here, then naturally the point would be, this light is what is the kind of ideas that you're referring to, which are actually present. So as on today, we are indeed actually looking for things where the light is. But what is it that we intend to seek is something which is not in the light. And this light is not enabling us to create, say, the lightning of the place which is dark. It's not actually creating that light for the dark, for which we need to recognize what is that light which can actually remove the darkness where our keys are lost. So that is a question which is at play. And that is a question that we indeed have to address, and a lot of effort needs to go in, and it will not be an individual effort, it's a collective effort. It might require, say, an entire nation to as well look for it. And there was such a movement when Indian national movement actually happened, where there were a large number of people who did think in these lines, and they indeed tried to actually look for that light which would throw light on that darkness which they intend to remove. I hope I tried addressing your question, Kusumaka.
Kind of, yes, but my question is, when we accept technology, when we accept everything of material, enhancement of life from the Western, when it comes to social life or something that upgrades the level of, say, certain sections of groups of society, why a hindrance in the name of tradition, while it is not affecting the society in a negative way, but it is an individual choice?
Is it indeed the case that we are sure that it is not affecting the society? That's a question that is
it's intended to, with the idea.
So let me actually give you one response which might bring a direct focus on what happened with India. At the turn of the 20th century, there were possibly, say, certain types of responses to this quote-unquote modernity, which is directly related to the scientific advancements and the kind of material advancements which changed the nature of how we end up living, and the kind of way in which the changes that happen. So that kind of a thing which calls for this material advancement was called as a civilization, so modern civilization, and this embrace of modern civilization. So what were the kind of responses that were to be found? So if one looks at Swami Vivekananda, one would actually find that there is a qualified acceptance. It's not a complete acceptance, but it's a qualified acceptance. If one looks at, say, someone like Mahatma Gandhi, it was a qualified rejection. He said railways should be treated as a necessary evil. And he had his own very strong reasons for the same. So the qualified rejection, qualified acceptance is again, say, a certain sense by which we are coming to terms with, say, the kind of state we are in the present. But if we are to actually try and move towards a kind of world where we are in control of what we intend to be, then that calls for, say, more than the kind of points that we might say we are qualifyingly accepting or we're qualifyingly rejecting. We should also have, say, whether it is going to be a total embrace, total acceptance, or a total rejection. So in the qualified acceptance, qualified rejection possibility, what are the kind of parameters that are present in terms of this qualified acceptance, qualified rejection is also a question that is still open. There are different kinds of measures at which this happened. But we aren't yet in a state where, say, we are completely confident of saying, I am ready to totally reject or totally accept. So I found, say, some very insightful lectures where Sri Samdong Rinpoche. Samdong Rinpoche was a great scholar, and he was former Prime Minister of the Tibetan government in exile. So I was fortunate to listen to him, where he, while speaking about Gandhiji and so on, he said, at the forefront of his beginning of the talk, he said, I am anti-modern. So for him to be a Tibetan Buddhist, and for him to actually follow the path of Buddha, and in the light of the Dalai Lama and the parampara that he belonged to, he, after extensive study, he felt, unless I am anti-modern, I can't be Tibetan Buddhist. And do we have such people even to this day? Yes, I mean, one popular reference to Amish people in say, United States of America comes. And then you will find that, say, there are people who try to make a pitch for this when economics, and specifically while talking of economics and so on, E.F. Schumacher wrote this book called Small is Beautiful. And one thing that we do see, the kind of technologies that we are faced with, increasingly complex technologies that one is placed with, is that each of these increasingly complex technologies have come to mean that we accept them for the kind of comfort that they provide, but we do not have complete control over what are the kind of quote-unquote unintended consequences of the embrace that one has actually made. And we do not even have the clarity about whether we can indeed, say, appreciate the unintended consequences, at least in principle, if not in practice. So, which is one reason why, say, I have actually insisted on at least having Swaraj in ideas, because in practice, maybe, say, we are much far away from actually embracing such type of a Swaraj where one can clearly be sure of where we are standing, what we intend to do, and where we intend to stop, where we intend to embrace, all these kind of questions. And here, Swaraj, even if it's taken in the utmost sense of the true moksha that one might lead to, and there's a state which is referred to as Jivan Mukta. So even if such a state is actually to be realized in practice, first it has to begin in terms of some conception of it in mind, given, say, where we are in the current time. So the posing of this question is itself, I think, is a beginning for us to start reflecting on. So for that, I should thank you for the question. So how at all are we to deal with this in terms of each and every aspect would call for us to be aware of the respective unfolding of each of those in terms of how the thought developed. So to put it in the language that I put in Dhamma Vyalakata and Bhima Bhasa Dhrida story, when the technology is made, what is the kind of vasana that it is having? Does it have kama vasana, krodha vasana, or moha vasana, and so on? So these are the kind of questions that we should be able to have a critique developed in terms of our own constructs. Because all the kind of modern day critiques of technology that are done, they are again being done in the light of the Western philosophical traditions itself. There was one such thing which came in from India, and that was actually in the open, it was Gandhian. And Gandhian critique only speaks of a folk understanding of what happened. It doesn't actually place itself in a proper understanding of the Shastras that we indeed have an opportunity to refer to and learn from. So that is one side. And there's a question that Prabhanjana asked, as Mahatma Gandhi states in his book, in Swaraj, to translate knowledge from English to Hindi for education in India. Isn't this also the way to buy or marry the Western materialistic world? I think, say, the question of translation becomes a very important exercise, because one of the key points that we find, even with respect to the European Enlightenment modernity, is that it is caused because of a great effort in terms of translating knowledge from the Arabs to, say, Latin, and from there, say, a great effort to try and make sense of what is being stated and a reflection on that. So today we also have a exercise started by our union government, which indeed intends to try and translate scientific knowledge from English into Indian languages. But one of the challenges that is actually, say, brought forth in that ground is that if we indeed create a technical language which is close to what we use, then one is indeed overloading language terms which are already known from Indian tradition with new meanings. As such, say, when we today mean English, the term Samaj in Hindi, it is understood as society in English, because Samaj as a word does not have any kind of a antecedent that of the society kind in terms of our own languages and their past. So Nataka Samaja is not the same as, say, the sense in which society is understood. So that calls for, say, fresh kind of possibilities. And this won't be marrying the Western materialistic world also, because you see, West itself has its own spiritual and material world. So it is not the case that, say, the effort to translate knowledge from English to Hindi or any such exercise has to be such that it is ignorant of this kind of connotations it leads to. But in a large scale, when it is done, we cannot but avoid the kind of consequences of such a kind of a problem. And you will also always have some scholars who would be pointing out that this is a fault translation. Like we have been doing this for almost 70 years now, that translating dharma as religion is a problematic thing. So in spite of that, say, that kind of usage still gets to continue. So now over time, say, one would probably have to try and do a samskara to the English word to try and ensure that it means, say, what we intend to mean. So it would still not be, say, buying or marrying. So we indeed have a case that one would have to address it with certain kind of conscious effort in the present, because ultimately, say, it is the language that we use which will shape the kind of futures that we intend to imagine. There's some question from Yatindra here. It says, technology adoption, social change, rejection. I feel both are transactions initiated by the West. Technology adoption has an economic price we seem to have willingly paid. Social change has a price we seem unwilling to pay because we don't even know what the price is. Even the benefits compared to better understanding of our traditions are unclear. So I think this is a, Yatindra, would you like to, I think this is a comment here, right? So if you'd like to add something more, you could.
Kusmaka was saying, just feel they are both transactional. They both have some price to pay.
So
it's not like we get the technology for free, just like we get the ideas for free.
No, I don't think even ideas are free, but the point still remains. One has to ask, I mean, if ideas are to be taken as free, then we are willingly submitting to them. So there's loss of freedom there also. So even they come with a price. But key point to notice is that if we come to the state that there is a price to be paid, then comes the question of, say, for good or bad, I've studied engineering. So one thing that I realized from engineering is that we are to actually think of trade-offs. So what is the trade-off that we are ready to pay? So every political decision is actually about what kind of a trade-off is actually bought with respect to a kind of transaction that one is actually making. And if in case the kind of trade-offs are clear, and in future there are people who intend to alter them, then they would have a clear path. If the trade-offs were not clear when the changes were adopted, which is the case with most of the kind of things that happened to India, where the embrace of whatever was presented was without critical kind of resolve in terms of critical reserve with which, say, it was analyzed and then, say, chosen, except in some very few instances. The mass scale adoption that happened is something that was because there was no kind of a critical element which can as well properly ground it. And even when there was such a kind of critical element, we didn't find, say, enough strength for such a kind of a thought because people felt there's no future for that kind of a thought. So the future is something that is in this direction only, which is a very short-sighted notion. Because at least in that sense, when Prime Minister Nehru, writing in Discovery of India, spoke of India as an ancient palimpsest, where all the previous layers are also still visible today, that was a very insightful kind of acceptance that even if we say that this is the direction that we take, Pandit Nehru was always ambiguous about it. Because he knew that Mahatma Gandhi wasn't in the same line of thinking as he was with respect to the embrace of modern development. So that kind of a thing today should have to be, say, rekindled with the knowledge of how would you as well think of Yajna Bhavana, like the kind that Prithu Maharaja thought of, wherein our desire for embracing, say, what we see as what we seek is something that need not be constrained, but it is actually sought over with appropriate efforts that we do in the present, which are also endorsed by the Shastras, because Shastras have defined what yajnas are. So that's a kind of challenge where we are placed where I don't think, say, the kind of learning that we have of Shastra has indeed created that kind of a place where we can confidently say that the modern day desires which have come about, they can be met by these kind of formulations. Though, of course, we find that many of our politicians still believe in it, whether or not common people do so. So we find that Yadurappa would go to Sringeri and he would perform some yajna. No, sorry, it was Kumaraswamy. Kumaraswamy gets to perform a yajna, and then even though his party gets a paltry number of seats, he becomes the chief minister. So these are things which are matters of belief now, because they aren't things which are discussed in public. And that is precisely where, say, the question of our own acceptance of where lies the power, because people always intend to side with that place which is what they consider it to be power. So clarification about the nature of that power is something that is still to be worked on, and it's something that is a point that I open it for further reflections and also for thought, because any kind of discussion about realizing Rama Rājya in the present is also about trying to say how would Rama Rājya as an idea gains the kind of conscious power in the minds of current people. So in what manner does this have to be articulated is a question that we are all interested in. And what I'd be doing is to try and create such kind of grounds where we can indeed say, see where this can possibly be directed at, how the efforts can be directed at.
Pranavji, I think it's 6:30. We will conclude the session for today. We will continue for the same discussion, I think, in the coming weeks.
So next week shall be on Swaraj in Ideas. So you already have the text of Swaraj in Ideas as well as the variety of reflections on it, including the kind of questions that are posed by you right now. And those reflections are things that we indeed have to get back to. So even if, say, you have read Swaraj in Ideas, please do read it again. And we'll try and do a, say, paragraph by paragraph analysis of what it means in our next week's session.
Excellent. So I personally looking forward for that particular session, because I have been listening and I have read about K.C. Bhattacharya's work, and especially with this specific article which you have been mentioning, Swaraj in Ideas. So this was another overwhelming, informative and igniting session. And thank you very much for all the participants who have participated. We will conclude this session with a Shanti Mantra. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah, Sarve Santhu Niramayah, Sarve Bhadrani Paschyantu, Ma Kaschit Dukkha Bhag Bhavet. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Ram Ram.